High bar or low bar? What kind of squatter are you? Hey guys, welcome back to our YouTube channel. It's Ben here from Learn ASP or Learn Australian Strength Performance. Really excited today because I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is squatting. Now, I'm going to keep it simple. We're going to be talking about the high bar squat and the low bar back squat. Now, what is the difference between a high bar squat and a low bar squat? Some of you may have actually seen numerous videos of this online. However, I found that a lot of these videos don't really explain the differences precisely and in points where you can actually take away to understand. So I'm going to do that today. We're going to talk about the differences between a high bar squat and a low bar squat, which muscles you're activating, and what's the main differences between both squats. How are you meant to perform it optimally? The first squat we're going to be talking about is the high bar back squat. And again, with the name high bar, that would give you an idea of why it's called this way, because the bar is sitting relatively high on my back. Typically, when you're holding or you're performing a high bar back squat, you want to make sure that the bar is also set at a relatively high level on the rack itself, so you don't have to go too low to bring the bar up. Now, in setting up for a high bar back squat, the bar sits high on my back, and you will see this and where it's positioned on my traps, my upper traps. In a high bar back squat, one of the main or the key features of this is bending the knees first. This is what we called a knee break strategy. So I break my knees, or I bend my knees first, and as I bend my knees, I start to descend with the bar. The goal is to keep my torso as upright as I can, maintain a full range of movement all the way down and up again. All right, so I'm going to perform that again, keeping my arms right under the bar, bend my knees first, and as I come down, keep my torso relatively upright, descending for a full range of movement, and coming up again. Typically in a high bar back squat, you would realize that my range of movement is a lot more. I actually am able to come down a lot lower. Typically, you would see the hamstrings clamp the calf at the bottom position. And the main thing is to ensure that your feet don't actually come off the floor, so you're not going on your heels. Now, again, if you've got ankle flexibility issues, that means your calves are tight or your ankles may have a previous injury, for example, you may not be able to descend as low because there's tightness in the area. So you can always use a heel raise, put a plate underneath your heels to raise your heels to allow you to go deeper. Alternatively, squat shoes are great as well because there is a heel elevation for squat shoes that allow you to go deeper. So that's a high bar back squat. The next squat we're going to compare it with is the low bar back squat. And again, as its name suggests, the low bar back squat means the bar is sitting a lot lower on your back. The first thing you need to do to set up a low bar back squat is the height of the bar itself. This being a high bar back squat, as I performed it earlier, in a low bar back squat right now, I'm going to set the rack a lot lower. And the reason being, I need to come under the bar and place the bar at a much lower position in my back, which also means the height of the rack needs to drop. But also at the end of the day, because I typically will be able to lift a heavier load with a low bar back squat, you will get fatigued. And in a state of fatigue, you don't want to be going on your tiptoes to try to put the bar back. You want to be able just to walk comfortably straight into the rack to put the bar down. So now that I've got my bar in place, a low bar back squat is where the bar sits relatively low on my back. So as opposed to a high bar where it's high, the low bar back squat, I will drag it all the way down, so much so that it's sitting just above my rear delts. Now, this is a strain. You can see my wrist actually bending. This is a strain for most people. Most people are not able to maintain a close stance holding the bar with their arms because it strains the wrist. And this is why typically in a low bar back squat, people take a much wider grip because it's less strain on the wrist. Now, if you do have the flexibility to actually hold the bar close, I suggest you do, because again, that gives you a very strong platform on your back to where the bar sits. It's a lot more stable. However, if it strains your wrist, wear wrist reps, and actually hold it in a wider stance. So I'm gonna perform this in a closed stance with my upper body. The bar sits close to the middle of my back, middle of my traps, above my rear delts. Now, as I step back in a low bar, what you want to notice is firstly that my stance tends to be a little bit wider than a high bar. As opposed to bending my knees first, a low bar is initiated by pushing my hips backwards. Now, typically, this is the type of squat that you guys may have learned, where you push your bum back, and as you push your bum back, your knee starts to bend. So the first movement I'm initiating in a low bar is a hip backwards. So it's called a hip break strategy. I push my hips back, and I sit into the movement. Now watch me as I do that. As I push my hips back and sit, notice that my body starts to lean further forward. So this is another characteristic of a high bar, is that as I push my hips back, my body tends to go further forward. My knees don't travel as far past my toes, and I'm only able to come down to a certain range before my hips lock out. So at about 90 degrees, I go up again, and I squeeze. So watch, I break from my hips, push my hips backwards, lean my torso slightly forward, go down just to a point where I can't actually go down any further, up, and thrust. Okay, so my hips go back and they come up in a thrusting movement. Once you finish the low bar, you should be able to walk comfortably into the rack and drop it down. Okay, so this is exactly why a low bar has a rack that's set low, because when you tie it, you can walk right in. So just to recap, here are the 5 points you need to remember for a high bar back squat. Point number 1, the bar sits high on your back. Your upper traps is where you hold the bar. Number 2, your arms tend to be closer in gripping the bar because that forms a stable platform for the bar to sit on. Okay, so that's very, very important. Point number 3, it is a knee break strategy. So you're bending your knees first as you descend. Point number 4, your torso is relatively upright. It's kept upright because your knees are being bent first. And the last point, point number 5, is that it gives you a larger range of movement as your knees travel past your toes. Now, typically in a high bar back squat, it's very much like an Olympic lifting squat. So if you have ever seen Olympic lifters lift, they will be performing what a high bar back squat is. The bar sits high and they have a big range of movement coming down, torso relatively upright as they bring the bar up again. How are you limited by this movement? If your range of movement is being limited by injuries or tightness and adhesions, typically at your ankles, this is where you need to do mobility work or massages to actually ease the tension within those areas to allow you to go deeper into the squat. I did mention earlier as well that a heel raise is going to be very beneficial if you don't have that range of movement. So there you go. That's the high bar back squat in short for you. It is a squat that is great for developing the quads more than other muscles within the movement itself. So it's a quad dominant activity. Now here are 5 points that you will need to remember for the low bar back squat. With a low bar, the bar sits a lot lower on your back, roughly at about the mid traps and above your posterior deltoids. This is where you position the bar and you pull it down to lock it in. With a low bar back squat, the grip width is also a lot wider. And that's because if the bar sits a lot lower, you tend to roll your wrist forward and that can put a lot of strain on your wrist. Typically, if you have good flexibility, you can actually maintain a close or narrower grip holding the bar. I prefer that because it gives you a lot more stability and the bar a lot more stability as you are lifting a heavier load. However, most people don't have the flexibility of the wrist and they prefer to take a wider stance. That's okay, provided that your back is pulled in tight while you're performing the low bar. Point number 3 that you need to understand about the low bar is that the low bar is what we call a hip break strategy. That means you push your bum back or you break from your hips first. In a hip break strategy, because your bum is being pushed back first, your torso tends to lean forward. And that brings us to point number 4. It is a squat that forces your torso more forward at an angle as you are squatting. And point number 5 that you need to remember for a low bar is that the range of movement is not as much as a high bar back squat. You typically tend to go down to about 90 degrees or slightly lower because your hips lock out and you're not able to descend all the way down because of the way that this is a hip break strategy, breaking from the hips first. Now with a low bar back squat, you tend to be able to lift more weights because you're breaking from the hips and your glutes is the predominant muscle that is being engaged in this activity. Comparing it to the high bar, where it's a core dominant activity, the low bar back squat tends to be a glute hamstring dominant activity. You also find that your knees don't travel as far past your toes. So which squat do you choose? You can see that both styles of squatting is not wrong. A high bar back squat is very much for an Olympic lifter and people who perform lifts that require the bar to be close to their body as they pull it up in front of them. It's a great core dominant activity that you can perform in the gym as well. A low bar back squat tends to be powerlifting focus. Why? Because the goal is about lifting heavier loads. And so if you are able to use your glutes and hamstrings to be able to lift a heavier load, you might as well do that. So the low bar back squat, again, more powerlifting focus, but you still can perform it in the gym. Now, I don't like to segregate my squats to say one is better or one is not. What is your purpose and what is your function of squatting? I would suggest that you incorporate both high bar and low bar squats into your routine because they are different variations of the activity that recruit different muscle groups. Both great activities, both activities that you need to try. So guys, thanks for watching today's YouTube on squats. The high bar and the low bar squats are very commonly spoken about, yet not many people can give you the distinct differences between both. Both are great methods and ways of squatting. One is not more superior than the other. I hope that you'll be able to incorporate these particular squats into your routine and actually let me know how you go. Comment below and I will see you in our next YouTube channel.